Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about the independence of African countries, where we'll learn all about the nationalist movements to remove European rule. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to explain how the Pan-African movement and nationalism led to independence in Kenya and Nigeria. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. Nationalism is the desire to be self-governed. The Pan-African movement is the goal of achieving unity of all Africans worldwide. Genocide means the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially of a particular ethnic group or nation. Independence from colonial rule has been achieved in different ways across the world. You have the armed revolutions like the United States, and you have the peaceful handover of power like Canada. Africa has over 50 countries, nearly all of which gained their independences in the 1900s, and from European countries that had used and abused the territory for decades. What was so wrong with colonial rule that African nations would want independence in the first place? The most obvious answer to that question is slavery. It was a routine practice for European traders to form a partnership with one local tribe and use them to abduct the other competing tribe members for slave trade, usually using European-made weapons. This legacy has continued to this day, because even though slavery has been outlawed across the world, slavery has never been eradicated in Africa, and commonly appears in African countries where law and order has failed. Another, more specific instance of Europeans' abuse across Africa is the country of Rwanda in eastern Africa. Rwanda is home to two major ethnic groups, the Hutu and Tutsi. The Belgians held Rwanda in its last years before independence and established an identity card system, separating the ethnic groups and elevating the Tutsi to a higher class in the colony. This inequality led to a Rwandan civil war shortly after gaining independence, and a Hutu attempt at genocide directed toward the Tutsi. In the middle of this conflict, a third, smaller ethnic group, the Twa, were nearly wiped out in the process, as the Hutu and Tutsi war was waged. One more example of European atrocities in Africa was King Leopold II in the Congo Free State, the present-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. Leopold, King of Belgium, convinced the Berlin Conference to grant him sole ownership of the Congo Free State under the claim that he would improve the lives of the native inhabitants. That's a laugh. Leopold extracted a personal fortune from the Congo territory, reaping ivory and rubber from the land, and using the native population as forced labor to do so. Somewhere between 1 and 15 million Congolese people died under Leopold's command. After a few years of this, his own country's government ordered him to give up the colony's control and return home. So what? How did European abuses in Africa lead to nationalism? If there's one constant truth in history, it is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Follow that up with the statement, for now, and it's true for all situations. While the pre-European history of the African continent involved much conflict between tribes, those differences were able to be put aside just long enough to fight against their colonial oppressors. Independence was achieved very differently in different countries of Africa. At the end of the 1800s, well-educated young adults began a movement of nationalism called Pan-Africanism. The prefix pan means worldwide, so Pan-Africanism was the movement to unite Africans all around the world along the shared goal of opposing European colonizers, founding independent countries, and creating a modern identity for all Africans. Nigeria's independence in 1960 is an example of Pan-Africanism working. Following World War II, Nigeria's young leaders began promoting self-government, and Great Britain began to recognize the country's enthusiasm for independence, eventually peacefully granting independence to Nigeria. On the other hand, Kenya's independence did not go over so easily. The ethnic groups of Kenya banded together in the Mau Mau Revolt. This 9-year violent protest, also against Britain, was also Pan-African driven. Eventually, in 1963, Kenya was given its independence as well, as Great Britain, after having fought 2 world wars, didn't have the resources to hold on to its empire anymore. While the 50-plus nations of Africa did gain their independence eventually, the goals of the Pan-African movement were not completely successful. On the continent itself, unity is inconsistent. When Europe was still in charge, the enemy of my enemy saying held true. But as soon as European leaders were ousted, many ethnic and tribal groups resumed their rivalries immediately. Additionally, while leaders like Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey promoted Pan-Africanism, the identity shift never really took hold worldwide either. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? I am certainly biased, but I, without a doubt, believe that teaching is the most significant job in the world. From a historian's perspective, I can easily observe the consequences of good teaching and bad teaching across history. If you look in some of the corners of the world that are struggling the most today, their experiences with colonial leadership were some of the most messed up situations ever. The Hutu-Tutsi conflict was entirely because the Belgian government taught them about class inequality and racism. The Democratic Republic of Congo has experienced government corruption, economic mismanagement, and allying with communist countries. You can bet their negative experiences with King Leopold led to a poor understanding of the good a government can do. There's nothing more important than being a good example to those who learn from you. Many of you students have younger siblings or friends that look up to you and take after your example. Whether you intend it or not, your choices, behaviors, and lessons will have an impact on their lives, just as your teachers' and parents' lessons have had an impact on your life. So, whether you become an actual teacher or just a leader or role model to your younger peers, make sure your example is going to help. Wow, so learning about African nationalism is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? How did Nigeria win its independence from Great Britain in 1960? What is nationalism? The Mau Mau used violence to fight for independence in which African country? Seeks to unify African citizens. Tries to make Africans more independent. Believes Africans across the world and African continent share common bonds and connections. The statements in the list above describe which idea? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about independence in Africa. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff, but do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.